Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull again, and I'm going to read out of a book. I actually have just felt inspired to do this, and I opened the book at random. Now, the book I found when I went to a friend's workplace yesterday, and it was literally sitting in the top of a box near the door. Suddenly I saw it and I knew I needed it. I grabbed it, and I know I have to sit and read this book. Now it's about digital disconnect. So hence the poem I've just written connects to this. Now, I'm a great believer in spontaneity. I know there's people in this world who don't think spontaneity is a desirable thing. They prefer things to be predictable and ordered. But actually, what spontaneity is it actually comes from the soul of you. When you act before you think, and this could be called impulse. It's not impulsive; it's impulse. And when you're a person who's very aware of yourself, when these impulses are positive. I seldom have negative impulses. Mine are mostly, if not all, positive. So I always act from that because I think truth comes from those moments rather than people thinking it through. And then they often decide against, whereas I often decide for. The heading of this is called Revisiting the Relationship of Capitalism to Democracy. That really interested me when I quickly saw it. With the foundation, let's turn to the relationship of economics to politics and look at the American experience. This is a good experience to look at because it's shaping the world. The catechism provides a more accurate picture of the American economy in the first half of the 19th century, at least in the northern states, than it does in more recent times. It is revealing then to see how the relationship of the economy to the government and the political system has changed since the catechism went for some semblance of reality to being mostly mythology. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but I guess it'll unfold. The key to effective democracy has always been clear. Democracy is when the indigent, it's an interesting word, isn't it? And not the men of property are the rulers. Aristotle observed in his Politics. If liberty and equality are chiefly to be found in democracy, they will be best attained when all persons alike share in the government to the utmost. I completely agree with that. What I see in the times we're in is it's mostly lawyers who are in there, and having had experience now with some lawyers, I'm seeing they're not always honest. And in fact, what concerns me about that particular profession is the impetus on winning. Oh, that was spontaneous, wasn't it? The impetus on winning. And what we actually want is people in public service who actually feel impulsed to become part of the government because they want to do good for the society. And we don't want the culture of that changing them into expedient practitioners of politics who simply sense where the power is and they make decisions from that basis. Now, that power could be the donations that are coming in to their political party. We want people to act from integrity. We want people to have a very integrated sense of values so they're not easily manipulated by others. We need people who have a really strong sense of public service, that they don't get confused about why they're there and that it's not their personal booty is the word. We want people who actually really respect that the money that they're working with is for the people. Goes on to say, notice that Aristotle was writing about democracy and republic some 2 millennia before anyone had even uttered the term capitalism or understood it as an economic system. Notice too that Aristotle emphasizes the tension between democracy and property. It was always understood this way prior to capitalism, democracy was all about empowering men without property. I always add in and women. In egalitarian property ownership. So that inegalitarian is not equal. Property ownership was democracy's mortal enemy. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to read that again. It was always understood this way prior to capitalism. Democracy was all about empowering men without property, and inegalitarian property ownership was democracy's mortal enemy. As democracy emerged in the United States and elsewhere, it was rare that wealthy property owners led the fight for its expansion. They were sometimes dragged along kicking and screaming. Many of the champions of the American democracy and civil liberties, from Tom Paine and Eugene Debs to Martin Luther King Jr., tended to be people on the left of the political spectrum, detested by many of those with property. What a shame that was the divide, rather than people having an evolved sense of diversity or even a sense of empathy, where you're stepping in someone's shoes and realising that the grievances have come from a sense of unfairness. Instead, they become hated. And this is where we have real problem with governance. And I see that as an immaturity. You know, mature people would sit down and work things out. Immature people, it's all about them. So I'll read on. Okay, it says the founders of the Republic and the people who fought for freedom from Britain included elements that were unsympathetic to the idea of democracy. And it is not hard to locate slaveholders and hypocrites among the most prominent. That being said, it is striking how truly revolutionary the American Revolution was. The people who rose up did so inspired by the words of Thomas Paine. And I'll actually add some of his words to this video. And the commitment to egalitarian politics was astonishing for the time. Would have been interesting to see it operate. The historian Gordon S. Wood said it was as radical in the late 18th century as Marxism would be in the 19th century. Equality meant more than formal political or legal equality. Noah Webster remarked in 1787, it required a general and tolerably equal distribution of landed property, and therefore genuine economic autonomy. Such a political economy would render severe inequality, corruption, and tyranny far less likely, and be most likely to promote liberty and popular, effective self-government. A localised, competitive, and mostly one-class market economy was the foundation of Jefferson and Paine's conceptions of an ideal democratic political economy, and Lincoln's as well. Slavery and feudalism, by their very nature, are inhospitable to anything remotely close to democracy. The emerging market economy in the United States in the early 19th century, specifically the northern states, was far more conducive to egalitarian politics, for property ownership was spread widely, and a large portion of the workforce was self-employed as farmers, mechanics, tradesmen, or merchants. A modern capitalism developed corporations, replaced the small-scale entrepreneurs, employed a large propertyless working class, so propertyless, no property, and generated massive fortunes unimaginable in earlier times, undermining the political economy most conducive to American democracy. Inequality mushroomed, poverty deepened, and there was a tremendous incentive for commercial interests to use their power, at times illicitly, to have the government advance their interests at the expense of the balance of the citizenry. There's no big shock in that, is there? This is actually one of the core problems we're facing today, is the advancing of these interests at the expense of the balance of the citizenry. So the so-called argument of social order and chaos, The chaos is coming from the advancing of those interests. Self-interest creates it. Selfishness would go even deeper into that. Control was what I said in my poetry. The process began to grow in the middle third of the 19th century during the Great Industrial Revolution, and it exploded in the decades after the Civil War, the infamous Gilded Age. The rise of great fortunes and the attendant political influence of big business horrified Lincoln. His first State of the Union address in December 1861, arguably the most important speech of his political career to that point, was given as the Civil War had begun and the Union was in a fight for its survival. The eyes of the nation, even the world, were upon him. Lincoln understandably dedicated most of the address to a discussion of the war and its importance. Then, astonishingly, he sounded the alarm about a problem far from the battlefield. In my present position, I could scarcely be justified were I to omit raising a warning voice against the approach of returning despotism. Now, I'm going to make a point here quickly before I continue with Lincoln. This is what we're facing today, right now. No surprise to me, spontaneously I opened up at this section. See, life brings answers to us when we're seeking them. He goes on to say the despotism that so concerned Lincoln was the effort to place capital on an equal footing with, if not above, labour in the structure of government. Lincoln elaborated on the notion. He says, labour is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labour and could never have existed if labour had not first existed. Labour is a superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. In particular, it was imperative that the wealthy not be permitted to have undue influence over the government. And there's a section indented here. No men living are more worthy to be trusted than those who toil up from poverty. None less inclined to take or touch aught which they have not honestly earned. Let them beware of surrendering a political power which they already possess, and which, if surrendered, will surely be used to close the door of advancement against such as they, and to fix new disabilities and burdens upon them till all of liberty shall be lost. That is very relevant for today, very. Now, the idea of artificial intelligence, I spoke about that in my poem. This is to replace labour. This is a statement of devaluing labour and not having to pay for automated tasks to be done. A robot doesn't want pay. But then we're creating programs to have them work out things, have them evolve their circuitry to become self-reliant thinkers. And there's a hue and cry going out around the world about this. We all saw The Matrix. Many have seen The Matrix, and we saw what machines did. What I've tried to express in my poetry is the intelligent design of the human being itself. And it may be very exciting when you're in the field of electronics and robotics to emulate creation. But that's playing God. And that's when you start to move into the realm of really changing the world for billions of people. Is it all about money is a key question. Is money really about superiority, or is it an unfair advantage? The handicap being those who are in the lower socioeconomic areas often don't get the advantage of education. I know that, having been an economist myself, I could see very clearly that without the knowledge I have today, there's no way I could have tackled various things that I've tackled had I been left in ignorance, which certain classes prefer. Goes on to say, it did not take long for Lincoln's warning to look prescient. In 1887, the retired 19th President of the United States, Rutherford B. Hayes, observed, "It is time for the public to hear that the giant evil and danger in this country, the danger which transcends all others, is the vast wealth owned or controlled by a few persons. Money is power. In Congress, in state legislators, in city councils, in the courts, in the political conventions, in the press, in the pulpit, in the circles of the educated and the talented, its influence is growing greater and greater. Excessive wealth in the hands of the few means extreme poverty, ignorance, vice, and wretchedness as the lot of the many. And yet it need not, if we were able to see ourselves in each other. So shift in consciousness is what's been stated on the planet today, is what's required. Because once you see differently, you realise we're all one, not one better than another, each here with their own purpose, unfolding. So it goes on to say, recalling Lincoln's stirring defence in the Gettysburg Address of the Civil War's appalling carnage as only justifiable if it protected democracy. Hayes wrote, "This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is a government by the corporations, and the corporations, and for the corporations." Paul Buhle, B-U-H-L-E, a leading historian of the American left, states that it was in this period, the 1880s, that capitalism was arguably most threatened by a popular uprising. Future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and that's E-I-S at the end, captured a growing attitude. I quote, "We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." Again, another line drawn in the sand where we sit here today, 2019. It is worth noting that in addition to inequality, some of the framers understood one other phenomenon as a contributor to inequality and cancerous for self-government. And there's militarism. This has been a concern since ancient Greece and Rome. James Madison thought it arguably the single gravest threat to the Republic. One reason why the Constitution had such strict rules to be followed before the nation can go to war, and strict prohibition on military involvement domestically, as he put it. This is James Madison. Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is, perhaps, the most to be dreaded, because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the best or are the known instruments for bringing the many under the dominion of the few. So the military is the way of keeping the many controlled, is essentially what's being said here. In war too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honours, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. The same malignant aspects in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manner and of morals engendered in both. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And of course the words endless war come up. Engineered? I'm amazed that I found this by chance, this article. I had no idea this was in here. I'll read on because it's only got another paragraph to go, but I think it's no mistake that I've found this. More prescient or brilliant words have rarely been written. By the second half of the 20th century, the United States became the leading military power in the world, and by the beginning of the 21st century, the most dominant military power in the world history. Militarism also produces a great dilemma for modern journalism and has meant that the military played a far larger role in the development and management of the internet than is generally recognised. I return to these issues in Chapter 5. It goes on to talk about corporate capitalism and weak democracy. I'll leave it there as something to consider and reflect on. In my poem, I talked about there was no need for war, no need for defence. It's interesting they connect to this that I've just read. I just want to go still for a moment about that. See, democracy is the sharing of power. It is the power of the people for the people. It is not about capital. It is not about the corporates having that type of control. The fact that they've had control for a very long time, which is very evident here since the 1880s in the US, I guess it's no surprise today that we're seeing increasing privatisation. Users' pay certainly came in when I studied economics. That was in the late 80s, 1980s. Actually, early 19... I studied up to 1991. That was really quite an important time to be studying economics because the shift from the public sector to the private sector was really evident at that time. We saw, profit moving to the top end of town at that time. Certainly, I remember from my studying the accord system that we brought in here in Australia was to trade off wage increases for superannuation, and now superannuation is pretty much divvied up into private sector companies, funding all sorts of capital projects, and we're not seeing a lot of flow back to the public as a result of this. Also want to state too that during wartime or even endless wars, the Constitution, certainly in the United States, can be suspended, which means the Bill of Rights is suspended. Here in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights, sadly, but we do have a Constitution, and there are certain provisions on government to provide various public services in accordance with that Constitution. But we're experiencing in certain aspects of that that's not the case. So we're at a really interesting point of transformation right now about where we go from here. Do we revitalise democracy, or does this become despotism? I think that's a more accurate word, where what we're seeing is a form of feudalism. Sort of the landowners, you can even cast your mind back to feudal England, where you had the very powerful landlords and peasants had no land holdings and they were very much beholden. Same thing happened in India. I remember Gandhi actually travelled to a part of India where he met with peasant farmers. There's a scene in the movie where they're literally starving and they're British overlords. The guy, he's negotiating with the governor and he's, these people, it's outrageous that they're wanting to be paid for the... I can't remember what they were growing now, but they needed to grow food. Often it's the case of, flowers are being grown instead of food. In the case of, I think, these peasant farmers, the rent had gone up, they couldn't afford to eat, and they were starving, and they put their complaint to this overlord, this landowner, and he wasn't sympathetic because he was living in another world to them. And he just thought it's outrageous that they should be asking for more when they had nothing. And that's the sickness of greed. That's what happens when you get caught up in greed. You believe you're a cut above everyone. I've seen it. I've worked with people who are very wealthy myself. That selfishness, of course, goes right across society. It's not just class-oriented. But as a lack of empathy is ultimately what enables a person to let others starve when they see them suffering and they care nothing for that other. They don't feel empathy because they're not integrated emotionally. They're very intellectual. They're also in a narrative that's reinforced by those of the same class. They also have a storyline around why others suffer, and they have to make it their fault. They might say they're not self-reliant or they are inferior. I've actually had it said to me by someone who considered herself of a higher class. She really surprised me because I put a question to her. I was testing her out, and she saw herself as superior to the lower classes. Genetically superior was the way she put it to me. And I remember laughing internally at her because I knew I had friends who were far more intelligent than she was, but they didn't have the opportunities that she had. Because see, once you're in money, you can make money. It's very easy. And what they don't understand is when you're in a structure that doesn't provide that money or increasingly narrows the opportunities to access it, or as we're seeing with education, now they're making it users pay. It's getting harder and harder for ordinary people to access. And there's no ordinary people, by the way. Let's just say those with less money to access universities. They can't do it. So this becomes a way of ensuring their ignorance so that they don't challenge that authority. And of course, the militarism that's been spoken about here is really to uphold the authority of that class, that wealthy class. They've always used the military for that. You know, we hear a lot of narratives these days about the rationale for war. In my opinion, it's been orchestrated. And that view is growing around the world for sure, that this has been deliberate. And certainly, you know, linking the military, certainly in the United States, with the oil or energy, Department of Energy, links those two, which makes it pretty obvious why they have accessed parts of the world where there's oil. So there are real questions for society to answer here as to what sort of world you want to live in and whether you're prepared to speak up democratically and get a conversation started about inequality in the real sense of the word. In truth, we're all equal, but the inequality happens because people are being viewed as unequal. And that's typically class-driven. Or there's divides left and right, which, as I said in my previous videos, is an illusion. Service to self, service to others tends to be the divide there. There's also a sense of entitlement. I certainly have encountered that sense of entitlement where people believe they have a natural birthright to rule. I personally am interested in self-mastery. I'm not interested in control or ruling. I've never wanted to control other people. But I am interested in self-mastery, which is really about to know thyself and be true as a form of self-actualization, which I see as the true power in this world. Betrayal of self is the highest betrayal. What goes around comes around. What you put out comes back. These are universal laws. So to conclude, I do believe we're at a choice point, not a data point at this stage. As humanity starts to awaken to the very shackles that it has experienced and the disadvantages that have kept it in a position where it cannot advance. But we are going to advance. This is the right time to advance civilization because of the flux that is occurring through environmental as well as economic, as well as financial, as well as technological change that is here. So with that, I will leave you to contemplate what this message, and may you find true liberty in the Statue of Liberty, which is always balancing the scales of justice. Take care. Bye.